It was a late afternoon when the sun started to dip behind the line of tall trees along the quiet highway. The road stretched endlessly with only a few cars passing by every now and then. Among them was an old pickup truck moving slowly, its paint faded and body dented in many places. The truck looked like it had seen many years of service, carrying stories within its rust and scratches. The engine rattled faintly as it rolled forward, yet it kept moving steadily as if it had no intention of breaking down, even though it appeared tired. Inside the truck sat an elderly man. His hair was gray, his hands worn, and his eyes calm. He had a quiet presence, the kind of presence that made people curious without understanding why. He drove with both hands on the wheel, focused on the road ahead. He was not speeding, not weaving between lanes, not causing any disturbance. He was simply driving home after running a few errands, minding his own business, content in his own world. But that day was not going to be ordinary. A police cruiser pulled up behind him, its flashing lights suddenly cutting across the fading sunlight. The siren blared once, demanding attention. The old man glanced in his mirror, sighed quietly, and steered his truck toward the side of the road. He was not surprised. In his long life, he had faced much more difficult moments than this. He slowed the truck gently and parked it near the gravel shoulder. The police cruiser stopped behind him and two young officers stepped out. They were both in their late 20s, full of energy and confidence, the kind of confidence that sometimes crossed into arrogance. One adjusted his belt and straightened his uniform as if preparing to make a point. The other put his hand on his holster, though there was no danger in sight. They walked briskly to the truck, their faces stern. "License and registration," one of them ordered sharply without greeting or politeness. The old man nodded calmly. "Of course, officer," he said in a steady voice. He reached slowly for the glove compartment, careful not to make sudden movements. He pulled out the papers and handed them over with steady hands. The officer snatched the documents quickly and began inspecting them with exaggerated seriousness. The second officer circled the truck, glancing inside as if expecting to find something hidden. He wrinkled his nose at the dusty interior and shook his head with a smirk. "Where are you headed?" the first officer asked. "Home," the old man replied simply. "I've been to town for groceries." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Home, huh? And you think it's safe to drive this old thing on the road? This truck looks like it belongs in a junkyard." The old man did not reply to the insult. He simply folded his hands together and looked straight ahead. He had lived too long to waste words on disrespect. By now, a few cars had slowed down, drivers turning their heads to watch. A small group of bystanders, drawn by curiosity, gathered on the edge of the roadside. They whispered to one another, wondering why two young cops had pulled over such an old truck. The second officer returned from circling the vehicle. "Nothing in here but some old boxes and tools," he muttered. "Looks like a pile of junk. Probably not even safe to drive." The first officer looked at the elderly man with narrowed eyes. "You hiding anything, old man? You been drinking?" The question carried a mocking tone, one that made the crowd shift uncomfortably. The old man's eyes, however, stayed calm. "No, officer. I haven't," the officer smirked. "You don't mind if we search the truck, then?" The man paused, then gave a small nod. "Do what you must." That was all they needed. Without waiting for proper reason, the two officers opened the doors and began rummaging through the truck. They pulled out the boxes, tossing them carelessly on the ground. Tools clattered against the gravel. A small wooden case fell open, revealing a collection of metals, each shining faintly in the fading sunlight. One of the bystanders gasped softly. "Those look like military medals," she whispered. The officers glanced at the medals but dismissed them with a shrug. They tossed them aside as if they were nothing more than trinkets. The old man lowered his eyes, hiding the storm of emotion in them. Those medals had once meant honor, bravery, sacrifice, but here they lay in the dirt, ignored. "Sit down on the curb," the first officer ordered. The old man obeyed without argument. He sat slowly, his movements steady, his posture upright. His dignity was untouched, even as the young officers towered over him with arrogance. The crowd grew larger. People started murmuring among themselves, some recognizing the quiet figure sitting calmly, others feeling uneasy about the way he was being treated. The officers, however, seemed blind to the shift in the crowd's mood. One officer crossed his arms, smirking. "You know, old man, people like you should stay off the roads." causing trouble with these broken-down trucks. You should be thankful we stopped you before something worse happened." The old man looked at them, his voice calm, almost soft, yet filled with a weight they could not understand. "You will regret this," he said quietly. The words made a few bystanders stiffen. There was no anger in his tone, no threat. It was simply a statement, spoken with certainty. The officers laughed dismissively, waving it off as nonsense. The wind grew cooler as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the road. The sound of the truck's cooling engine clicked faintly in the silence. The crowd waited, sensing that something about this encounter was unusual, though they could not explain why. The old man sat silently, his eyes distant as if he was looking far beyond the moment. And so part one ended with tension hanging thick in the air. The police thought they were in control, but the bystanders felt a quiet storm building. The old man's calm words echoed in their minds. "You will regret this." The old man sat patiently on the curb while the two officers continued to go through his belongings. The gravel beneath him was rough, and the evening air carried a chill, but he did not complain. His calm eyes followed their movements, steady and silent while the people gathered nearby whispered among themselves. The sound of clattering tools and boxes filled the air as the officers pulled more items out of the truck, tossing them carelessly to the ground. One officer opened a bag stuffed with old clothes, shaking his head as if disappointed. Another pulled out a tin box that held family photographs, each picture worn with age. The officer glanced at them for only a moment before dropping them carelessly back into the bag. The photographs spilled out onto the gravel, pictures of a younger man in uniform standing tall beside other soldiers, medals shining on his chest. "Nothing but junk," the first officer muttered, clearly frustrated. He wanted to find something that would justify stopping the truck. Instead, all he uncovered were fragments of an ordinary man's life. The second officer kicked at the medals lying in the dirt. "What's this? Some toys you picked up at a pawn shop?" he asked mockingly. The old man looked up at them. His lips pressed together, but he said nothing. He knew the truth of those medals. They were not toys, not trinkets, not empty ornaments. Each one was earned with sweat, courage, and sacrifice. But explaining that to men who laughed at them seemed pointless. The crowd grew restless. A woman in the group whispered to her friend, "Those are real medals. My brother has one like that. You don't just buy them anywhere." The officers, however, ignored the murmurs. They pulled open the glove compartment again, searching with irritation. When they found nothing suspicious, one of them sighed loudly. "Old man, why are you driving this thing? Do you even realize how unsafe this truck is? You could be hiding anything in here." The old man finally spoke, his voice low and calm. "This truck has carried me for many years. It may not look new, but it still serves its purpose. There is nothing dangerous in it, only what you see." His words carried dignity, but the officers laughed. One leaned down toward him. "You talk fancy, but you're just another old man driving around in a wreck. You're lucky we even let you sit there instead of locking you up." The bystanders shifted uncomfortably. They could feel the arrogance dripping from every word the officer spoke. Some of them wanted to step forward to defend the old man, but they hesitated. They did not want to get in trouble themselves. The first officer straightened up and called out to his partner. "Radio for backup. Let's get another unit here. If nothing else, maybe we'll tow this heap of metal and get it off the road." The second officer grinned and nodded, reaching for his radio. He called in a request for assistance, making the situation sound more serious than it was. His voice carried through the static. "Possible suspicious driver, vehicle needs further search. Requesting backup." The old man lowered his eyes once more, letting their words pass over him like waves crashing against a rock. He had endured harder moments in his lifetime. He had stood under fire, faced storms, and lost friends. This humiliation was painful, yes, but it was not unbearable. What struck him more deeply was the lack of respect for something as simple as human dignity. The crowd noticed the medals again, scattered across the dirt. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, those medals look like the ones Grandpa has in his frame at home," he said in a small, innocent voice. The mother nodded softly, her eyes fixed on the officers who treated them like nothing. "Yes," she whispered. "They are." A silence spread through the crowd for a brief moment as people began piecing together the truth that the man sitting quietly before them was not just an ordinary driver. His past was marked by service, by honor. Still, the officers refused to see it. The second officer returned to the truck, shaking the seats, looking under the dashboard, even tapping on the panels as if expecting hidden compartments. "Nothing," he grumbled. "It's just falling apart." "Check the back again," the first officer ordered. "Maybe there's something under the boxes." So the younger man returned, tossing more things aside, his impatience growing. He found an old folded flag tucked into one of the boxes, carefully preserved. The fabric was worn, yet cared for with love. The officer picked it up, raised an eyebrow, and tossed it back without a thought. The crowd gasped softly. They knew what such a flag meant. It was not just a piece of cloth, it was a memory, a symbol of sacrifice. To see it treated so carelessly sent a ripple of discomfort through everyone watching. The old man watched silently, his calm never breaking. He did not rise, did not argue. He simply let the officers dig their own hole deeper with every careless act. Finally, when they had gone through nearly everything, the first officer walked back to him. He crossed his arms and looked down. "You sit there all quiet like you're better than us. But let me tell you something, you're not. You're just another man driving an unsafe truck, wasting our time." The old man raised his eyes slowly. His gaze was steady, strong, almost unsettling in its calmness. "Time will show you the truth," he said softly. "You will regret this." The words carried no anger, no shout, no insult. They were simply spoken with certainty, like a fact already written. The crowd grew even more uneasy, whispering to one another. The bystanders felt something stirring in the air, a sense that the officers were blind to something much larger than themselves. The officers laughed again, dismissing his words. One of them shook his head. "Crazy old man," he muttered. The backup request had gone through, and soon distant sirens could be faintly heard. The sound echoed down the road, approaching steadily. The officers smiled, confident that more of their colleagues would soon arrive to support them. But the bystanders stood quietly, their eyes on the old man, their hearts unsure. They felt a strange mix of anticipation and unease, as if the air around them was holding its breath. The old man sat still, his medals scattered in the dirt, his belongings tossed aside, yet his dignity remained unbroken. His silence was louder than their mockery, and his calmness carried a weight none of them could yet understand. The road stretched on, the sun sinking lower, the shadows growing longer. The officers believed they were in control, but in truth the moment was slipping away from them. Something was coming, something they could not stop. The old man's voice echoed once more in the minds of everyone present. "You will regret this." And as the backup sirens drew closer, the crowd waited, not knowing that the real storm was yet to arrive. The sound of the sirens grew louder in the distance, echoing through the quiet evening air. The officers straightened their posture, both smirking with confidence. They believed backup would give them even more authority, more reason to prove themselves right. The old man, however, did not move. He sat calmly on the curb, his belongings scattered around him, medals glinting faintly in the dimming sunlight. His silence was not weakness, it was strength, though the officers could not see it. The crowd had grown larger. Families returning from town stopped to watch. Drivers pulled their cars over, and even people from nearby houses stepped outside. Whispers filled the air. Some people exchanged worried looks while others pointed at the medals on the ground. A few recognized certain decorations and ribbons, realizing they were not ordinary symbols. They were medals of honor, medals that only true heroes could earn. Yet the officers continued treating them as worthless objects. The first officer, eager to impress, crossed his arms and looked at the old man again. "You know, this whole thing could have been avoided if you just stayed home. Look at all this trouble you've caused." The old man raised his eyes slowly. His voice was calm, as steady as before. "I have caused no trouble. Trouble is in the way you see things." The officer frowned. "Are you trying to be smart with me?" The old man did not reply. His silence unsettled the younger man, though he would never admit it. The crowd, however, felt the weight of those quiet words. The second officer tapped his foot impatiently. "Backup will be here soon. We'll make sure everything gets sorted out," he said loudly, as if reassuring himself. At that moment, a few people in the crowd began whispering names. "I think I know him," an older woman said. "I saw him once at a Veterans Day parade. He was sitting in the front row. They introduced him as someone important, but I can't remember the details." Another man nodded. "Yes, I've seen him too. He was at the town ceremony years ago. Didn't they say he was one of the most decorated soldiers from the war? The whispers spread, and soon the crowd looked at the old man with new eyes. He was not just a quiet driver of an old truck. He was someone who carried history, someone whose story was greater than anyone realized. The officers noticed the murmurs but ignored them. They believed the crowd was simply gossiping, nothing more. They focused only on proving their authority, blind to the truth forming right in front of them. The old man sat quietly, his medals still lying on the ground, his folded flag resting in the dirt, his photographs scattered. To anyone else, these items might have looked like scraps, but to those who understood, they told a story of bravery, sacrifice, and honor. Minutes later, the backup sirens faded as another police car pulled up behind the first. 2 more officers stepped out. They were slightly older, more experienced, but they followed the lead of the younger men who had first made the stop. They asked a few questions, but instead of carefully listening, they accepted the quick explanation. Suspicious old truck. Driver might be hiding something. The older officers nodded and stepped back, choosing not to interfere too much. The situation, however, had already started slipping away from control. The crowd grew restless. Murmurs turned into louder discussions. People pointed at the medals, at the flag, at the photographs. Some began calling out, "Those are real. Don't you see?" Others muttered angrily about the disrespect being shown. The air was heavy with unease, as if everyone was waiting for something. The old man finally spoke again. His voice was soft, but it carried. "I told you before, you will regret this. Not because of me, but because of what you are showing to the people around you." The officers stiffened at his words, though they still tried to laugh them off. "Oh yeah?" one said mockingly. "And why's that?" The old man simply lowered his gaze, refusing to argue. His patience unsettled the officers more than shouting ever could have. Just then, a low rumble grew in the distance. It was not the sharp cry of sirens, but the steady, powerful hum of engines. The sound was different, stronger, heavier, more disciplined. Heads in the crowd turned, eyes widening as several black SUVs appeared far down the road, moving quickly and smoothly, unlike normal traffic. The crowd grew quiet, sensing something important. The bystanders stood straighter, the whispers stopped, and the only sound was the approaching roar of engines. The younger officers, however, did not yet understand. They exchanged confused looks, unsure who the new arrivals were. One of them muttered, "What's this now?" The old man lifted his head slightly, his calm eyes focused on the approaching vehicles. He did not smile, but there was a faint shift in his expression, a quiet knowing. He had been waiting for this moment, perhaps expecting it all along. The SUVs drew closer, their polished black surfaces reflecting the last rays of sunlight. They moved with purpose, keeping perfect formation as they slowed near the stopped truck. Dust rose from the road as they pulled to a halt, engines rumbling in unison. The crowd watched in silence, their anticipation building. Something about the way those vehicles moved, the way they stopped, the way the men inside prepared to step out. It was not ordinary. It was disciplined. It was official. It carried authority that went beyond the small town and its officers. The first SUV door opened, and men in formal uniforms stepped out, scanning the scene quickly, their eyes sharp and their movements precise. They did not look like ordinary security or local officials. They carried themselves with the discipline of soldiers. The 2 young officers froze for a moment, unsure how to react. They exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing this was no small matter. The crowd whispered louder now, voices filled with awe and excitement. "Who are they? What's happening?" someone asked. "Military," another replied. "Look at how they move." "This is serious," the old man said silently, his posture calm and straight. He did not need to say a word. His dignity was enough. The second SUV door opened and more uniformed men stepped out, their eyes focused directly on the elderly man sitting on the curb. One of them whispered quickly into a radio, signaling something to the others. The officers' confidence began to waver. Their smirks disappeared, replaced by uncertainty. They shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the situation was no longer in their control. Then the crowd gasped. The door of the third SUV opened and a tall figure stepped out. He wore a crisp uniform adorned with stars that glinted even in the fading light. His steps were firm, his presence commanding. It was clear to everyone at once this was no ordinary officer. This was a man of the highest rank, It was a four-star general. The murmurs in the crowd turned into stunned silence. People looked at each other with wide eyes, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The young boy who had recognized the medals tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "That's a real general." The general walked forward with authority, his eyes fixed on the old man sitting quietly by the roadside. The officers stood frozen, their arrogance melting into confusion and fear. The old man slowly lifted his head to meet the gaze of the approaching general. And at that moment, everyone watching knew the truth was about to be revealed. The crowd held its breath as the tall figure walked forward. His polished shoes struck the pavement with firm steps, and his uniform carried authority like a banner. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders gleamed under the fading sun, and every movement showed discipline and command. People in the crowd whispered his title, but their voices were hushed, as if they dared not speak too loudly in his presence. The general did not glance at the officers. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on one man, the elderly driver of the old truck still sitting quietly on the curb. For a moment, silence stretched across the entire roadside. Even the evening breeze seemed to pause. Then something happened that none of the bystanders could have imagined. The 4-star general stopped in front of the old man and raised his hand in a sharp salute. His posture was straight, his expression serious, and his voice carried across the gathering as he spoke. "Sir." The crowd gasped. The young boy who had pointed out the medals clutched his mother's arm. A woman covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. The weight of that single word, "sir," was enough to shift everything. The old man slowly lifted his hand in return, acknowledging the salute with dignity. His calm face revealed no surprise, only quiet acceptance. The people realized in that instant that this was not just a man with medals in a box. This was someone who had once held enormous responsibility, someone who had commanded respect at the highest levels. The 2 young officers stood frozen, their mouths slightly open. Their arrogance had drained away, replaced with pale, uncertain expressions. They looked at each other, confused, but neither dared to speak. The general turned toward them finally. His eyes were sharp, cold, and filled with disappointment. "Who is responsible for this?" he demanded. The first officer swallowed hard but tried to keep his voice steady. "We stopped him for suspicious behavior. The vehicle looked unsafe and we—" The general cut him off with a raised hand. "Enough." His voice was firm, commanding. "Do you know who this man is? Do you have any idea what he has given for this country?" The officers stayed silent, shifting nervously. The general stepped closer to the old man, lowering his voice so the crowd had to lean forward to hear. "Sir, I came as soon as I was informed. Forgive the disrespect you've endured." The old man nodded slowly. His words were calm as ever. "You did not cause it. They did." He gestured slightly toward the officers without anger, without bitterness, only stating the truth. The general's jaw tightened. He turned back to the 2 officers. "You handled this man's belongings like trash. You treated him with mockery. Do you realize you tossed aside medals that represent sacrifice and courage? Do you understand that the man you humiliated is one of the most decorated veterans this nation has ever known?" The crowd murmured louder now, some nodding in recognition, others whispering stories they had heard about the old man's past. It was becoming clear to everyone that the quiet figure on the curb had lived a life far greater than they had imagined. The younger officers looked down at the ground, their faces red. One of them tried to mutter an excuse, but the general's piercing eyes silenced him instantly. The soldiers who had arrived with the general began picking up the old man's belongings carefully. They dusted off the medals, folded the flag properly with precision, and gathered the photographs with respect. Every item was treated as sacred, as symbols of a life lived with honor. The crowd watched in awe, seeing the stark difference between careless arrogance and true respect. The general motioned to 2 of his men, who stepped forward and gently helped the old man to his feet. Though he had moved slowly, his posture remained straight. There was strength in the way he stood, even with the weight of years upon him. The general spoke again, his voice clear. "This man is not only a veteran. He is a hero who once commanded soldiers in battles most of you have only read about. He has carried the weight of lives, the responsibility of victory, and the scars of sacrifice. And yet today he was treated like nothing." The silence was heavy. The crowd felt ashamed for standing by, though some had tried to speak up. The officers, however, looked crushed under the general's words. The old man finally spoke, breaking the silence. Respect is not for the uniform. Respect is for the person, and sometimes people forget that the one who looks small may once have stood tall. His words carried wisdom that sank deep into everyone's heart. The bystanders nodded, their expressions filled with respect. The general turned back to the officers. You will face consequences for this. You have dishonored not only this man but the uniform you wear. Remember this lesson well. Authority without respect is nothing but weakness. The officers said nothing. They stood stiffly, regret written across their faces. The soldiers opened the door of one of the black SUVs and the old man was guided inside with honor. But before he entered, he turned once more toward the crowd. His calm eyes swept across the faces, young and old, and he gave them a small nod. It was not pride, not anger, but a gesture of understanding, a reminder that respect is earned, not demanded. The general saluted him once more before stepping aside. The door closed and the SUV's engine rumbled to life. The convoy prepared to leave, the dust beginning to rise again. The people stood silently, still processing what they had witnessed. A man they had thought to be ordinary had been revealed as extraordinary, and the officers who had mocked him now stood exposed in their own shame. As the SUVs rolled away, the crowd remained whispering among themselves. They spoke not only about the old man's past, but about the lesson they had all just seen with their own eyes. That dignity does not come from appearances, but from character. The officers remained by their car, pale and quiet, no longer boasting, no longer laughing. They had been humbled in front of everyone, and their regret was heavy. The general's words still echoed in the air, strong and unforgettable. And though the convoy disappeared down the road, the memory of that moment stayed with everyone present, a story they would carry for years. The black SUVs rolled away slowly, their engines humming in perfect rhythm as the convoy disappeared into the distance. Dust rose in the air and then settled, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than before. The crowd remained frozen for a moment, still stunned by what they had witnessed. They had seen two officers mock and humiliate an elderly man, only to learn he was someone far greater than any of them had imagined. They had seen a four-star general salute him with respect, and that image stayed in their minds like a picture that would never fade. The two young officers stood by their cruiser, their faces pale and drained of confidence. Their proud stance was gone, replaced with nervous glances and heavy silence. They had thought themselves in control, but now they looked small, surrounded by a crowd that no longer admired them. The same people who had once respected their badges now shook their heads at their arrogance. The police chief arrived minutes later, rushing to the scene after hearing reports of the incident. He was an older man with years of service behind him, and when he stepped out of his car, his face grew grim as he noticed the unease in the air. The crowd pointed at the officers, whispering angrily, and the chief quickly realized something serious had happened. He walked over to the two officers, his voice sharp and demanding. "What on earth have you done?" Neither of them could answer properly. They stuttered, tried to explain, but their words fell apart under the weight of the truth. The chief listened, his expression darkening with every sentence. Finally, he raised his hand, silencing them. "Enough, I don't need excuses. I just saw a four-star general leave this place and I know exactly who that man is. You have humiliated a war hero. Do you realize what that means?" The younger officers lowered their heads, shame burning their cheeks. The chief shook his head, his disappointment deep. "You've disgraced yourselves, this department, and everything this badge stands for. Respect is the foundation of our duty, and today you forgot it. You will regret this mistake not only because of the punishment you'll face, but because this crowd will never forget." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some nodded, others folded their arms, and a few openly spoke out. "They treated him like dirt," one man said. "They didn't even care about his medals." Another added, "I'll never look at them the same way again." The officers could feel the weight of the eyes on them. It was worse than any lecture, worse than any fine. It was the knowledge that their arrogance had been exposed in front of everyone. Meanwhile, the old man sat quietly inside the SUV as it carried him away. His face was calm, his hands resting on his lap. The medals, the flag, and the photographs had been returned to him, placed carefully and respectfully by the soldiers who traveled with him. He looked out of the window, watching the fading crowd in the distance, but his mind was far away. He thought of the battles he had fought, the lives he had seen saved and lost, the years of service that had left him with scars both seen and unseen. He was not angry at the young officers. He was disappointed, yes, but not in them alone. He was disappointed that respect was often given to appearances instead of character, to uniforms instead of actions. He had lived long enough to understand that people forget quickly, and sometimes the greatest lessons had to be taught in the hardest ways. Back at the roadside, the chief turned to the crowd. "I promise you," he said firmly, "this will not be overlooked. Discipline will be taken. We owe it to every man and woman who has served this nation to show respect, no matter what they drive, no matter how they look." The crowd clapped softly, some out of relief, others out of agreement. They began to disperse, their conversations filled with the story they had just seen unfold. Parents explained to their children why the medals were important, why the general had saluted, why respect mattered more than pride. Neighbors walked home together, shaking their heads at the mistake of the officers, but also grateful that justice had been shown in such a powerful way. The young boy who had recognized the medals walked beside his mother, still wide-eyed. "Mom," he said quietly, "why didn't they know who he was?" His mother sighed, holding his hand. "Because sometimes people only see with their eyes, not with their hearts. They saw an old truck and an old man, but they didn't see the hero sitting there. Let that be a lesson for you, son. Never judge by appearances." As night fell, the story spread quickly. By the next morning, the entire town was talking about the incident. Newspapers carried the story, though the general's name was never fully revealed. People spoke of the old man with respect, calling him the quiet hero, and every retelling carried the same lesson. True dignity cannot be hidden by age or appearance. The two officers faced consequences within their department. They were suspended, their records marked with shame and their names spoken in disappointment. But the punishment that stayed with them most was not official. It was the memory of that moment when the general saluted the man they had mocked. That image haunted them, a reminder of their failure, a reminder that arrogance had blinded them to truth. The old man, however, returned to his quiet life. He did not seek fame or revenge. He lived simply as he always had, but the people who saw him afterward looked at him differently. Neighbors greeted him with more warmth, strangers nodded respectfully, and children whispered his story with awe. The four-star general never spoke publicly about the incident, but his presence that day had been enough. His salute had said everything. It was a salute not only to one man, but to every soldier who had served with honor, every person who had sacrificed without expecting recognition. And so, the story ended with a lesson that echoed long after the dust had settled on that quiet road. Respect must never be based on what someone drives, what they wear, or how they look. True respect belongs to the heart, to character, to the unseen battles a person has fought. The crowd that day had witnessed more than an argument between police and an old driver. They had witnessed the weight of history, the meaning of dignity, and the power of humility. And while the officers would live with regret, the people would live with a reminder: never underestimate the quiet ones, for they may carry the greatest stories. The old truck remained parked in front of the man's home, still rattling when it drove, still dented and rusted. But to those who knew the story, it was no longer just a truck. It was a symbol. It was the reminder of the day when two careless officers learned a lesson they would never forget, and when an entire town rediscovered the meaning of respect.